Hello, my name is Greg Madison, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of The Living Process. My guest this time is Rob Parker. Rob is a psychologist, and he's very well known in the focusing world for all of his work on the process model. And in this discussion, we talk a little bit about his beginnings, his first kind of training, and some of the places that he worked, and sort of some of the insights that he had that brought him into the focusing world. It's interesting as well that we talk a little bit about the experiencing scale, the inner critic, and some of the ways in which a process model can actually change your understanding of psychotherapy. So I found it a very invigorating discussion and also quite gentle. So I hope you find this of interest. The Living Process with Rob Parker. Hello, and welcome back to The Living Process. My name is Greg Madison, and my guest this time is Rob Parker. Welcome. It's very nice to see you, and I know that you're well known in the focusing world and beyond. But maybe it would be okay just to start by telling us a little bit of how you ended up in the focusing world or found Gendlin or the practice of focusing.
Well, this could go back into my childhood if you want. Uh,
Sure.
so, um, I I came from a family that was a troubled family, you could say, and fifth or sixth grade,
Mhm.
I had a I, my family was not religious, and I was not raised to be religious, but I felt there was something wrong here with my world and myself, and I prayed for help. And I said to God, if you help me so that I can help others. If I want to help other kids who are going through what I'm going through, nobody should go through this. And uh, that led to uh, going into psychotherapy.
Mhm.
Um, I did therapy myself, but it wasn't terribly helpful. It probably was a little bit grounding. And so I became really interested in um, like I grew up in a world of behaviorism. You probably know that too.
Yeah.
Uh, and in some way, if you just look at it, the face of it, and you erase the PhDs and stuff, like these people are crazy. So I took a course in the um, the psychology of spinal cockroaches, and the idea was that you know this world, right?
Yeah. It's coming back to me.
Yes, yes, yes. We will. Uh, and so the idea was that you want to, like everything that we are, must be a series of learning connections. And you want to study this in the simplest, most reductive way that you can, because that's how science works.
Yeah.
So the simplest learning system that you could have would be a cockroach, except the cockroach with a brain is already too complex. So we cut the spinal cord, and then we study how spinal cockroaches behave and learn. And that'll be a basis for understanding people. And they really believed that.
Mhm.
Uh, so I I got interested in that, and just not in spinal cockroaches, but in the fact that people could believe that. So the psychologist in me wanted to study the psychologists,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Mhm.
that was the beginning. Uh, and I went to I was in the U.S., went to Canada, uh, not because of the draft, because the lottery of just bonkers.
Mhm.
I didn't have to go sent off to Vietnam. because of my birthday came up in the lottery as somebody that wouldn't have to go.
Right.
And but I went to Canada anyway, uh, with just the feeling of that it was just too crazy, and I wanted to try another world. And worked in a psychiatric hospital and ran into the same thing. There was a grand rounds where they presented somebody who was depressed, and the person was not responding to medication. They didn't really have psychotherapy in those days. It was something like Rogerian counseling or something, or psychoanalysis. Um, but they tried all these things and it wasn't helping. And particularly, uh, they were very interested in medication in this hospital. And so we go through like 90 minutes of, we see the guy on stage and, interviewed by the psychiatrist, and he's depressed and he won't get better and stuff. And at the very end, as we're wrapping up, somebody says, "Oh, by the way, what's going on in his life?" And this toss, it's just something going on in his life. Yeah, that his wife had just died. And this is a true story.
Oh, I believe it.
Oh, yeah. And I've seen this kind of thing even today. In fact, it's common. You want to solve human problems with medication. Um, so I went to graduate school, discovered existential phenomenology, became a born again convert, and then went back to the United States and found that in the United States, nobody is interested in philosophy. After a few years, I was feeling starved for a conversation about philosophy. And I remembered, I learned, I can't remember how I learned this, but there was a guy named Gendlin who lived not too far away from me. And it was around 2000, I think. And he had just moved from the University of Chicago and retired in Spring Valley. And I was in White Plains, which is not too far from Spring Valley. But what I knew about him from graduate school was that he was a follower of Merleau-Ponty. And so that was my man. And so I wanted to meet Gendlin, and so we could talk about Merleau-Ponty. And I had no idea that Gendlin had anything going of his own. And so I did a little bit of research, found out that he was doing a workshop, and so I show up at this workshop, and I believe it was at Stony Point. And it was a 3-day workshop on thinking at the edge. And I knew nothing about either Gendlin. I'd never heard of focusing before. And so, but I had, from my own experience, I had developed something like focusing. Like I'd spent a lot of time alone as a child, and I used to just notice my own mind, and I noticed things that I called thought shapes that were not ideas or concepts, but they were felt meanings. And I remember lying in bed when I was in like probably third grade, and noticing these thought shapes and thinking, wow, this is really interesting. Somebody should do something with this. And and so I learned, but I had some background, but I learned focusing in half an hour over a picnic table at Stony Point with, I think it was Robert Bruger, taught me how to focus. And so then that was my entry into focusing and Gendlin.
That's I've got two responses. One is how lucky to have Gendlin as your kind of neighborhood philosopher. And secondly, I think you're the first person, or maybe one of two, who came into the focusing world through philosophy.
Hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's not a common way in, as far as I know. In fact, I think there's a lot of philosophers that come across Gendlin, but never then get interested in the practice and take it further.
Right.
But you must
Yeah.
have done that. You must have found something in it that you continued.
Well, I had been writing a book about the wisdom that I had accumulated, figuring out what's wrong with these, it's psychotherapy and psychology, and it came down to me. I brought this with me from Canada and sort of wrote the book a little bit up until the time that I met Gendlin. Um, but I'd figured out that meaning is at the root of all of this, that we ignore meaning in our culture. And we want to objectify everything and reify everything. And I also figured out that meaning is in the body. And I uh, and I also knew Marleau-Ponty.
Mhm.
And the the paradigm shift from my Merleau-Ponty experience was in graduate school. And I came to graduate school filled with Gregory Bateson as an alternative to behaviorism.
Okay.
And to go from Gregory Bateson to phenomenology, it took me about 4 years. And I was able to do it because of the people that I hung out with in graduate school. I shared a house with them and we spent a lot of time together. And uh, I would say that I learned probably as much in the cafeteria as I did in the classroom because of the conversations that we had.
What was
And
it that you that what was the attraction of phenomenology for you?
it was that I could tell that these were smart people, that they were fun to talk to, and they seemed to have some kind of coherent way of thinking that didn't make any sense. And and then with their and I also like, there were some classes that I took. Like I took a course where one of the readings was Thomas Kuhn,
Oh yeah.
and so I had a kind of an orientation that there's something interesting here. Um, but what's interesting to me now, looking back on it, is the fact that I was a pretty smart person, pretty thoughtful, pretty articulate, and also open to learning. And but I was also well ensconced in a different way of thinking.
Mhm.
And I'd also, how to say this, I'd grown up in my background, my family, like one of my grandfather was a really a sort of an exemplary scientist, and both in his thought and in his career. And I learned from him a very rigorous kind of scientific way of thinking, uh, in as a kind of like a culture, like an art form almost, like it's beautiful. It's in a very precise, clear way. But it took me 4 years to make that paradigm shift, and I that to me is interesting. It's like um, I was young
Mhm.
and I was pretty open-minded, and I wasn't just going to swallow bullshit. So I wasn't saying that I was open and ready to learn, but I was ready to listen to arguments and to
Mhm.
discuss. And we had like a 24-hour a day, a break for sleep, a break for classes, but otherwise it was a 4 year symposium. And it wasn't until about 4 years that it suddenly it dawned on me that there's a different way of thinking here. And
Can I just ask, I'm curious
sure.
whether that's what sounds like it turned out to be a peer training in phenomenology. Did that come into your practice in any way? Did it influence the way
Mm-hmm.
relating to clients?
Absolutely. Yeah. That was my alternative to behaviorism. And so built a practice, yeah, a whole way of thinking about therapy
Mhm.
as an alternative to behaviorism. And so, yeah, that was foundational. Um,
I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit about that? If you're practicing phenomenologically, you might be going from the sort of the concrete interaction in some way to your thinking about it. And I'm just curious, how would it, if I observed you with a client, what would I
Hmm.
see that I would later think that's actually very phenomenological?
Hmm. Hmm. Um, okay, so two things. First, I want to go back to the paradigm shift, and we were talking about people coming to here to Gendlin from philosophy,
Yeah.
and I would say that using me as an example,
Mhm.
uh, it took me something like 4 years to grasp Marleau-Ponty. From the time I met Gendlin, it took me about 3 years to realize that Gendlin was doing something seriously different, and and I was a pretty open-minded guy, not committed to to staying with one paradigm. Um, and so I can see how philosophers would have a hard time understanding Gendlin.
Mhm.
And
But in Gene's work at that time, it took you 3 years to see that he was doing something that was like an alternative to what you had been developing, or
mhm, mhm, mhm. Mm, yeah. At first, I thought he was doing something very close to what I was doing.
yeah,
Basically, I was assimilating him into
yeah,
me,
yeah, exactly.
and then gradually realizing the differences. It took about 3 years,
Mhm.
um, and and then when I realized that, then I made a decision. Like I realized I'm talking to somebody. This is like a 100-year phenomena, like once a century genius. And so I just decided, and I'm living close to him. So I just basically dropped everything else in my life and decided, um,
I want to just mark what you've said there because I think that's really, really so fundamental for all of us that when we first come across something new, we understand it in the old thing we already have.
mhm, mhm.
And you took this courageous step of saying, I'm going to set aside what I already think and open up to how this man understands himself and
Well,
really expose yourself to his philosophy.
yeah, that was after when I began to get traction with
Oh,
his thinking.
yeah.
But there was a couple of years where I thought, well, focusing is pretty neat, but that's kind of something that I already knew,
Mhm.
and and the whole way of thinking about about psychology, and it felt very much like humanistic psychology to me, and I
Yeah.
was very much knew that world.
Yeah.
So I recognized it as just more of what I already knew, uh,
Could you
and
say
so.
could you say anything about um, what alerted you that this actually is unique in some way? I can't just be fitted into the existential or humanistic model that I already know, even though it might sound similar.
uh,
Hmm.
it was a kind of a gradual dawning.
Hmm.
Focusing seemed very interesting to me. The interesting to me about all of this is
Hmm.
how long it took me to make these shifts.
Yeah.
And so the idea that you could just explain something to somebody and they'd say, "Oh, that's interesting. Tell me more."
Yeah.
The probably the first step is for them to get really upset and to ask you to leave or something. Uh, it's very hard to make a paradigm shift.
Yes.
And especially as you get older, it's harder and harder.
Well, I think one of the things you're pointing to is that one of the first steps is to realize it is a different paradigm.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yes, I think so. But then you have to also know about paradigms, and knowing about paradigms is a different paradigm, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
for reductive science, and reductive philosophy, like there's just one way to think, and that's the correct way, which happens to be the way that we think.
Hmm.
And then we can judge everything else by how close it is to how we think.
I can certainly hear how Kuhn would have appealed to you because you were
Hmm.
already in that kind of meta position,
Hmm.
noticing psychologists and how they
Hmm. Hmm.
practice as though they believed what they were saying and then would go home and live in a very different way and not even
Yeah.
notice the
Yeah.
discontinuity there. So, can you tell us a little more of where your journey kind of led you once you got into focusing and working with Gene?
Well, the first thing was realizing that he was a philosopher who was thinking in a systematic way that was significantly different from Merleau-Ponty. And when I realized that, that was part of the realization of like I really wanted to spend time with this guy.
Yeah.
And so I but a lot of people wanted to spend time with Gendlin, and I, how do I get him to notice me? You know, and so what I found out that he did a therapy practice, and so I told him I wanted to be in therapy with him, and I wanted to pay his fee, but I didn't want to talk about me. I wanted to talk about his philosophy, and so I paid him therapy rates for for some amount of time to talk about philosophy.
Wow.
And then when he realized after a while that I was pretty serious and was listening to what he was saying, then he dropped the fee. And then we were off and running. And I met with him every week for several, for over a decade. And I this seriously had the feeling of, like this is a lifetime opportunity not to be missed. I want to learn everything I can from him.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so then how did it affect me?
Yeah.
It was a growing process. I had a kind of a mixture of Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, and I was really impressed and still am by Sartre's chapter in L'Être et le Néant uh, about existential psychoanalysis. And I'd taken a course at the University of Geneva called Le Psychanalyse Existentielle selon Sartre. And I just, part of the reason for taking it was just that it sounded so neat. The title is so beautiful. But so I was very, very interested in, like my initial approach before I met Gendlin was finding a place where people were not being straight with themselves. And Sartre would have used stark language like lying to themselves or something. And and I used that language too, but not in the pejorative sense that we would use. It's not simple. When we lie to ourselves, we're hurting ourselves, and it's not a simple question of honesty or dishonesty, but in a way it is. It's existentially being present to our existence.
Yeah.
And so I was interested in the existential moment where somebody sort of faces themselves, and I've
Mhm.
found ways of creating situations where people would do that, and and then you'd get remarkable changes, like in one session a person would change, and it could look like magic, like you did something in one session, but
Mhm.
it's actually what I tried to do was to find the place where there's a kind of a tectonic,
Mhm.
two tectonic plates, like two worlds that the person is maintaining that are incompatible, and they're trying to maintain them both at the same time.
Yeah.
And what I would do is make them both explicit to explicate each one of them separately, but carefully and thoroughly, so that I could, or we could in therapy, evoke the felt meaning as well as the thinking of each of those ways of thinking with just a few words, like you'd have what we'd call a handle in
Mhm.
focusing language.
But
And then
let me just check
then
with I'm
go
I'm
ahead.
I'm thinking in the back of my mind in the Sartrean terms of bad faith
Hmm.
that you are making explicit the cognitive dissonance, the holding a belief that you at some level know is untrue.
Yes, yes. And then what I was doing then was to cultivate like a comfort and being able to hold each world,
Mhm.
um, and we could share it and sort of feel it together. And but I was careful to keep them separate. And then in one therapy session, I'd bring them together. And and then what would happen is that often something would just pop inside of them, and they'd say, "I'm not going to do this anymore."
Wow.
Um, so there was like one woman who was an abused by her husband, and it was a complex story. And I was actually a therapist to both of them. But this is way back in the beginning before anybody knew about battered women or anything. Um, but I could see what was going on. And she had a deeply ingrained sense of something wrong with her from her own childhood, and that she didn't deserve any better than what she was getting. She deserved this. And so once we had developed that thing explicitly, and she felt it and she could believe it, um, I told her, okay, now for our next session, I want you to go home. And every time we had reduced the whole thing, or reduced, we'd found a handle for the whole feeling from her childhood that she was no good and this is what she deserved. And so this is what she deserved became a handle for the whole feel of everything. And so I sent her home with the instructions that every time he abuses you now, I want you to tell yourself, this is what I deserve. And she came back the next week, and I asked, "You can see what's coming, right?"
Yeah. Wow.
That she came back and she said, "I'm sorry, I was not able to do it. I did it like the first three times and it was work, but this fourth time I did it, I just exploded. This is not what I deserve." And I let him have it. And and then from that time, he never abused me again. You know, like that changed both of them. And so that was a kind of a Sartrean approach. And uh, it was I'd say it was interesting, and it worked a lot, but it didn't work every time, and it was
But a very powerful example, and I can hear how the experiential is already in that.
yes, yeah, that was before Gendlin.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was Merleau-Ponty and Sartre.
Hmm.
Um,
Interesting.
and so when it works really nicely, and you could go to conferences and present it and stuff. Uh, but often it doesn't work, and there's a lot of time spent setting it up
Hmm.
for it to work.
Yeah.
But still, it's something. It's interesting. Um, but then, so it took me time to absorb a different way of doing therapy. Um, Part of it was I I took this psychotherapy course with Mary Hendricks, which is like a 2-year program. And then I went into therapy and we also continued the program informally with the group of us after the 2-year course ended. And so a lot of discussions with her, and then also being in therapy with her, uh, gradually letting go of that kind of quick fix model, and feeling um, that if you go to the felt sense, um, as you try to connect with the felt sense or find the felt sense, you're doing something that has fundamental traction, and it doesn't depend on setting something up or having the person right in the right spot where they can make a shift quickly and things. You're doing something that's essential and and what would you say, deep. You've got real ground. You're not depending on any kind of circumstances
Yeah.
if you're listening to felt meaning.
Yeah.
And that grows and develops by itself.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm thinking is the kind of the structure of the therapy shifts from
Hmm.
being the therapist's responsibility to something the process itself provides.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Interesting.
That's a good way of putting it, that you can trust the process.
Yeah.
And yeah, when I do therapy now, actually, I think about that often because um, I've been trained to do cognitive behavior therapy, and it's interesting to me that people take an approach like that seriously, and and not to denigrate it. Like there are arguments for CBT,
Hmm.
but in a broad way, it feels just very limited, and it's so it's interesting to me that people do that, and the um, the way in which focusing oriented therapy uh, can actually, like you can make parallels between focusing oriented therapy and CBT. Uh, like when do you know what I mean?
I'm waiting to hear.
Well, it's that if you in CBT, what you want to do is you want to find the irrational thoughts or the dysfunctional thoughts, and they can be buried. And so you spend some time trying to find the thought, and then you dispute the thought, and you give them homework and stuff, and they learn rationally not to believe this thing that they believe their whole life, and that's therapy. Um, if you look at a movie of what's going on without considering the underlying process, um, focusing oriented therapy, you can see the kind of a period where you're looking, you're feeling into a problem and trying to find what we would call the felt sense or felt meaning of the problem. Um, and and then when you get to some place, there'll be a shift, and the person will say, I thought this all my life, but it's not true. And then um, so if you looked at a movie, you could say, well, that was the irrational thought. And then they disputed the thought and then they got better. But actually, what's going on is that the work for us is not in finding an irrational thought, but in following the felt meaning
Yeah.
and explicating it. And when it opens, or when they feel the felt shift, then they say it in with words, but the actual change is not in the words; it's in the felt shift.
Exactly.
And so then, right where cognitive therapy would begin, we would say, aha, there's the irrational thought. Now we begin disputing it. That's actually where focusing oriented therapy is ended. Therapy's over when they have that. Not really over, but like the main work has been done. And so on the outside, it looks the same, but in some way, they're mirror images of each other, where the work for us is in the leading up to that,
Mhm.
what is often a statement like, I believe this, but it's not true. And for the CBT people, that's right where therapy would begin.
I would wonder if also you might say that if you can pinpoint in your so-called irrational thought, um, that we know in FOT that the thought itself is an explicit manifestation of something that's more than the thought. It has a lot more
Yeah,
to it than just what can be said about it.
that's right. Yeah.
And that if we stay with it, pretty soon what happens is, yeah, there was an insight, there was a shift, and then, oh, there's more. That
Hmm.
wasn't the whole story. And the whole thing kind of starts again and it just continues. Whereas in CBT, the way you're describing it, I'm thinking the thought is taken as sort of the fundamental phenomenon in some way, whereas with us
Yes,
it isn't.
yes, I think so. Yeah, and it goes with a whole culture that wants to reduce the problems to language problems and
Exactly.
misunderstanding of language and so on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um, so in a way, we have less work to do because we can trust the process, and we know that whatever comes,
yeah,
if you can hear the felt meaning underneath,
yeah.
and you can follow the felt meaning, and that's the skill.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So it may be just as much work is being done, but we just do less of it.
That's right. Yeah, yeah, exactly. We're sort of um, following the felt sense, and that we trust the process.
Mhm. Can I ask, I'd like to get into sort of some of the things you're doing more currently as well, but just because we hit this point, I want to ask, I've asked a few other people this. Um, when we talk about the process and the felt sensing and the carrying forward and stuff, how do you understand that? How do you understand that there is such a thing?
Um, well, I would say that that we assume that the meaning is in our language and in our words, and I think that's a pernicious idea. It's not true. Uh, that the meaning is in felt meaning, and it's or implicit, and you have this. It's in the intricacy of life. Even before it's felt meaning, it's not meaning. It's not felt. So it's just kind of implicit. Um, but that's where meaning is. That's where change is, and that's where life is. And so when we ignore that, and
Hmm.
especially when um, we suppress that
Hmm.
in various ways in our culture, we're doing violence to ourselves. And I think we see the symptoms of that all around us. So I think this is a really serious thing. This is not just a kind of a philosophical game.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like you would say, in some way, that you would say that this process, this simply is what life is.
This is what life is, exactly. Yeah, yeah. And what we're going to do is we're going to stuff it into a box and we're going to label the box. And then we're
Yeah,
going to
exactly.
rearrange the boxes. And it's just, it's not good.
Yeah. 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 It doesn't work.
Yeah. Um, and yet the world of boxes of concepts, the conceptual world is um, so enticing, and a lot of us spent a good part of our lives trying to learn to think that way articulately and to get degrees and stuff as rewards for doing that. Um, it can be hard to give that up.
Yeah, I guess if we can use those, like the boxes as you're describing them, as almost like you would use a poem, as something that would evoke more experiencing and
Yes,
try
yes,
to think further from the box, think out of the
that's right.
box, I guess.
That's right. Yeah, think out of the box. Yeah, yeah. That yeah, and that's a paradigm shift for the client then,
Yes.
or for ourselves if we're doing that.
Yeah.
And um,
Yeah. That can I just
yeah,
mark that?
sure.
That's really important because
Yes.
I think that can be a very fundamental challenge that not only is this client in therapy talking about whatever's going on in their life and trying to solve issues or whatever brought them there, but they're also, as a side effect, learning something fundamentally different about life itself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's not why they came into therapy.
Yeah.
You know, that's interesting.
You're off onto an adventure, but it's vital. It's a vital adventure. It's rewarding. There's life in it. It's
Mhm.
life-giving, life-affirming. but also can be disorienting.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So if we kind of just go back to your journey, you worked with Jean, you worked with Mary for a number of years in different ways. Where has that taken you?
As a therapist or as a person.
I would say as a therapist, as a person, in terms of your philosophical thinking, any way that you'd like to answer that.
Well, I'd say, yeah, if I could talk to myself at the time, when I was maybe in therapy with Mary and was sort of, a little bit into Gene, and I'd been reading the process model, but hadn't really absorbed it. And it's a paradigm shift, and so you read it over and over again. Um, so I would say that one of the things that I did was I gradually gave up the kind of the quick shift Sartrean approach for a more gentle, kind of just manifesting, helping to manifest what's implicit
Mhm.
approach, and trusting what's implicit, and uh, uh, and that is radical.
Mhm.
Like sometimes crazy things will come up in therapy, or things that are maybe could be scary,
Yeah.
and you just trust the process. Yeah. Um, and um,
So that was a big
Working in
impact
it,
on your
that was a
practice.
big thing. That was a big thing.
Yeah.
Um, and I worked in a psychiatric hospital, but both like a children's psychiatric hospital, because um, part of my vow as a child to help other kids. I did help
Well,
other kids, and I worked most with children a lot. But that also, the children's problems are parents' problems, so I worked with the parents mostly. But
well,
uh,
let me ask you a further question in terms of your practice.
mhm,
Um, Once you started to read, maybe read and kind of really digest the process model, which I know you've done,
mhm.
um, did that influence your practice, or did that influence the way you thought about therapy, or have any impact?
Totally, totally, yeah,
Curious
yeah,
about.
yeah. So the shift would have been and was letting go of the kind of the existential confrontation and realizing that it's life itself that that wants to grow, and we
Mhm.
can trust it to grow. And so I don't have to know what's going on in therapy. I have to know where the felt meaning is in all of the distractions that are happening, to be able to feel in the core of that where the felt meaning is, and reflect that and try to nurture that. And everything else takes care of itself. And with a lot of details that require some skill and training, but basically it's how to get out of the way.
Yeah.
Um, so that was one thing that was important. And then you were asking me, how have I changed
Hmm.
as a result of the process model?
Yeah.
Um, I understand much better the cultural problem that we're in, and also the human problems that are related to that. Um, and There's a deep connection with spirituality.
Hmm.
Um, for example, there's a paper by, well, there are a number of papers by the Kyoto School of Zen Buddhism, who are philosophers who studied Western philosophy and sort of dialogue with us, uh, although most of us don't listen. Uh, but they're smart, and they understand their own tradition, and they also understand our tradition. So it's interesting to read them. And they're saying a lot of things that Gendlin's saying.
Yeah.
They're very much in tune with the process model, although they're asking different questions, and so they don't go as far as Gendlin does into the kind of the building a coherent conceptual system, but definitely leaning in the same direction. and then they go further in other directions so that there's a kind of a benefit from learning both.
Can
Um,
I just ask if can we just go back a bit to how a process model has influenced your understanding of like the cultural situation? I'm curious about that.
it's so vast. It's like asking you, what's it like to live in England?
Let me ask you a more specific question.
Okay.
Um, I've got a few. One, just because we're on this topic, you've had a recent election in America.
Yes.
Um, is there anything in the process model that helps you understand that differently than you might have if you hadn't read the process model?
Yes. Yeah. So let me see.
Very difficult question.
Um,
I'm curious what you
no,
might.
it's like one simple answer is that that our culture has been a kind of a top-down conceptual culture at least since Ronald Reagan,
Mhm.
and that top-down conceptual neoliberal way of rationalizing things and having a system of rules that just happen to benefit a few people at the top, but it's for the good of everybody.
Mhm.
Um, that kind of approach has crushed a lot of people in this America. I think also in the UK and also in Europe. Anne Applebaum has written about this. Um, and so what you have is a nation where a significant number of people are committing suicide, deaths of despair, and you have like 60% of the culture is living from paycheck to paycheck, and and people are in deep pain, and that is ignored in our culture, except in a couple of editorials that we'll do to sort of tisk tisk about the deaths of despair or something. There's in a cohesive society, I would expect, and I've seen this in Canada when I lived in Canada, there was a cohesive society in those days. There would be concern, like these are our neighbors. We don't know them, but they're part of our society. We should care about these people.
Yeah.
If somebody's feeling enough despair that they're going to kill themselves, then we know that they're not just asking for attention, right? And that we should care, and we should be asking, who are you and what's your life like, and and just and to acknowledge them. And so I see that as a deep problem in American culture. I also was struck by the division between blue collar and white collar when I moved back here from Canada, that the blue collar world is denigrated in this society.
Mhm.
And so the people that make things happen, the people that actually do stuff and fix things and build things, those
Mhm.
people are looked down upon.
Yeah.
And that's harmful to our culture. And then what's happening, I think, is that those people are just feeling alienated and pissed off. And
Mhm.
so they vote for somebody that affirms them. And you also there's the gendered thing,
Mhm.
the rise of of women, the empowering of women, and then men being left without a viable identity in our culture. And so the empowering of women, of course, is a good thing. But we also have to care about the boys and the men who feel left out of that.
That's
So
in,
all of that.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's interesting because it makes me think that this manifestation of um, the more conservative right wing populist kind of politics in America, for example, but it's not just America.
Yeah. Yeah.
It can be seen as a backlash.
Hmm.
And I think that you're saying that partly it's a backlash to a real top-down kind of imposition on to living process.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you're also
Yeah.
saying more than that, I think. You're suggesting that um, life tries to find a way to go on living.
Yes.
and that some of this political development is an attempt to carry forward life, even if you might think it's misguided or it's not actually going to work or something, at least it's some attempt to go on living.
Yes, I agree. Yeah,
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 that gives me more compassion for that. Yeah, for
yeah,
that
yeah, me
side.
too. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And then one of the things that Gene taught me is that there's whatever you say about history, it's like a person. Whatever you say, it's going to be much more complicated than that.
Hmm.
And so there are many threads
Yeah,
in many
exactly.
aspects.
Yeah,
But that's a major one.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
no, you're
yeah.
absolutely right. Whenever I hear commentaries about what happened in the American election, for example, um, every answer seems far too simple. It's like you have to put them all together and then it's still too simple.
It's still too simple. Yeah. You know, like I was in the hippie movement back in the day,
Mhm.
and there were all kinds of cultural stories about what caused that. And
Mhm.
having been there, I can say it's more complicated than that. There are
Yeah.
many, many people doing different things and for different reasons. Yeah.
And it's arising out of individual circumstances, not just
Yes.
cultural
Yes.
circumstances.
That's right. That's right.
Can
Yeah.
I just ask, in terms of the process model and therapy, one of the things that has come up, and I think rightly, has talked about a lot by therapists, is this philosophical principle of interaction first.
Hmm.
And I'm wondering if that's for you, if that's something out of a process model that feels relevant to your therapeutic practice when you were practicing.
Um, what I feel in therapy is a problem that wants to carry forward in some way.
Mhm.
And what I want to do is to listen to that and to help it uh, carry forward. And then I'm part of the interaction, of course. Um, but I'm not concerned with that. I'm, you know, like I'm just concerned about the process and
Yeah.
feeling the process.
So let me say that back to you that your attention is on the process as it's arising from the client, but you're also,
Or together in us, between us also. Yeah,
or together, yeah.
yeah,
But you're also aware that your attitude of listening itself has an impact in the process. It changes the environment in a way that the process happens differently than if you weren't attending with that kind of listening attitude.
yeah, yeah. But I think one of the things that we can fall into as therapists is following rules of some kind. So if I'm a Rogerian, I want to listen empathically.
Yeah.
But if I'm listening empathically, I'm not actually listening empathically. I'm being manipulative, right? And so the real thing to do is to cultivate in ourselves an openness to humanity, to other people, to and to want growth,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And that's kind of a personal process in us, but also in the world. And so in therapy, I'm not thinking about myself, whether I'm empathic or not. I'm thinking about what's the truth of this situation and what's the
Yes.
felt implicit that's trying to grow here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
want to get myself out of that story.
Yeah, exactly. If your attention is on whether you're meeting the therapeutic conditions,
That's right. That's right.
then you've already subverted them in some way.
That's right. That's right. One of my teachers, Jack Gibb, used to say, if you have to ask, don't ask.
Yeah.
If you have to ask, are you meeting the therapeutic conditions? Then,
Yeah,
you know,
exactly. Can I just ask you about a couple of things? I know we don't have too much more time. We've taken quite a bit of time, so I don't want to miss out on a couple of these things that I think you're more recently engaged in. One of them is the experiencing scale. I think you have an interest in that. I'd be
Yeah,
curious
yeah.
to hear. Yeah.
So it goes way back. It's the interesting that when we're in therapy,
Hmm.
we find that direct reference and allowing the direct referent to carry forward has huge impact in
Hmm.
psychotherapy. And it's not just it's not a small thing. It's a huge thing. And what we find with the EXP scale is not huge changes. That we find a small to moderate correlation in the Pascal meta-analysis. Um, so I just got curious about that and began looking at the EXP scale and also looking at the research that behind it, Gendlin's early research and then the other research, and came across this very important study by Watson and Bedard, 2006, where the only study I know of where they broke the correlations between outcome and EXP down by EXP level. So you can find in the good outcome subjects and the poor outcome subjects what percentage of time in therapy was spent at EXP 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. And so I put in a chapter in your 2014 book that if you look at that, what you find is that level 6 accounts for a huge difference, and level 5 accounts for a tiny difference, and the other levels don't make any difference at all. So that tells us we're measuring the wrong thing. You shouldn't be measuring EXP as a range. You should be asking, are people doing whatever they're supposed to be doing in level 6? And so I got interested in and as I pursuing that, um, began looking at the actual EXP scale and realized that they're measuring actually something different from what Gendlin meant by experiencing. So Gendlin's experiencing is direct reference and then direct referent carrying forward a felt shift. And what they're interested in is emotions and being aware of emotions and processing emotions to carry the understanding of emotions forward into about understanding your life and making better life decisions. Those are two completely different models. And so my conclusion now is that we shouldn't be using the EXP scale, and we should have noticed this 50 years ago. I mean, this is, you know, um, and the research on EXP doesn't actually have much bearing on Gendlin's uh, focusing oriented therapy. And that Gendlin's ideas actually haven't been tested because there hasn't been proper measure.
Hmm.
And so what I found, I was working with some other people to develop the reliability for this, but we've developed a simple scale where um, basically you have openness to uncertainty is the basic model that I came up with. And so, first of all, are you sure about everything conceptually? You know the truth about everything. And then the second level is, are you able to entertain a question, a serious question about your understanding? So if something important in your life, are you sure that this person meant what they said to you or what you understood them to mean? Or is there some possibility you might have misunderstood? So can you question your conceptual certainty in a deep way? And then if you can question your conceptual certainty, can you then also be open to a direct reference, like a feel of something that you can't put words to? And that's a deeper openness to uncertainty, right? And then if you can do that, can you stay focused on that direct referent with a friendly, open attitude? so that it can develop on its own terms, and you can listen to it. And that would be so a 4-level scale, and it's much simpler than the EXP scale. Like, and anybody who knows focusing could immediately, you could go out and use this in the next hour, I think, right?
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
Um, it immediately makes me wonder, are we really talking about different levels of experiencing, or are we talking about different attitudes towards experiencing?
I'm not sure I understand you. Could you say
Well,
more?
because I'm thinking at the first level, the attitude is very closed towards your experiencing. You already
Yes,
know.
yes.
You know the answer. You're not
Mhm.
open to your own
Yeah,
experience.
yeah,
In the second level, you're encouraged to entertain another point of view, basically. Could there be
yes,
another point of view?
yeah,
Which is opening your experiencing somewhat, but you're
yeah.
not maybe directly in contact with the felt quality yet.
That's right.
You're working up to a level where what you're developing is greater and greater open relationship to your experiencing.
Hmm. Hmm.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, except that in the level 2,
Yeah.
you're living still completely in a conceptual world,
Yes.
but you're able to ask questions, and you're not sure about everything.
Yeah.
And so and we know that in therapy, right? You get these people that just know the truth about everything,
Oh, yeah.
and those the I think
Sometimes
that
it's,
way of thinking, the 4 levels of categorizing this, helps us think about
Mhm.
uh, how to deal with that, how to
Yes,
help those
definitely.
people.
Definitely. Yes. Um, I find that really, really interesting.
Uh,
I'm wondering as I listen to you if the emphasis on experiencing is slightly misleading, and if what we really are emphasizing is something more like a fuller and fuller development of the focusing attitude.
yeah, yeah, I think so. Yeah, and the notion of experiencing as a continuum, as in the EXP scale,
Mm.
uh, I think it's a viable hypothesis. So I don't want to argue that it's just wrong and they should pack it up and go home. It's a viable hypothesis, but I don't think it's right. And I think that Gendlin's formulation is better.
Yeah.
Uh, for the emotion focused therapists,
Mm.
they read EFT into Gendlin.
Yes, exactly.
And so we had a 50-year miscommunication. And it's a little bit distracting that in the manual, they actually use Gendlin's language in places.
Mhm.
So at the beginning of the discussion of each level, they, especially the top levels, you find language that makes you think, aha, they're talking about direct reference here.
Yeah.
But then if you go further and into their elaboration, it turns out, no, they're not. And then if you look at the scoring examples, it's really telling. So if the scoring examples where the first one where they're hitting level 6 in the scoring example, uh, you can just look at it and they're clearly not doing focusing. They're talking about emotions.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I think what their research has shown is that talking about feelings is has low to moderate correlation with therapy outcome, and that feels about right. Talking about feelings alone isn't going to be enough, but if you don't talk about feelings, you're probably not going to get very far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. It reminds me of what you were saying at the beginning that the first stage is to try to assimilate the other paradigm within your own.
Yeah.
And certainly, whenever I come across anyone outside of focusing that talks about focusing or Gendlin or the felt sense, in some way, they usually quite fundamentally misunderstand it.
Yes.
And I imagine we do the same with EFT and all sorts of other orientations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I try hard um, to enter the other world. I've
Mm.
in my whole life I've tried to do that. So I've got a stack of books and articles now about EFT where I'm trying to learn what do they mean to process emotions.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
and so I yeah, but I don't know. Like I'll probably I don't know if I'll be able to do it or not. But all we can do is try. Yeah, and it's a challenge, and
yeah,
it can be it can be time consuming.
yeah,
Do we have time to do it? It's another
exactly.
question.
But
Yeah,
it does feel better, doesn't it? It feels bodily, it feels better to do that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You know who you're talking to, and you can appreciate where they're
Yeah,
coming from.
exactly. And there's a greater openness inside of your own body if you open up to the other.
That's right.
Feels better.
Yeah.
Which maybe kind of relates a little bit to the last thing I really wanted to ask you about is about the inner critic, because I know that you've done some work on working with the inner critic, and I'm curious about,
Uh, yeah. So this comes back to my childhood and my sort of a quest. I want to help other kids that go through what I go through,
yeah,
and and I can see the boundaries. Like therapy is um, there's a lot to be said here, but I don't think therapy is always helpful to kids. I
yeah,
think often what kids need is just the truth, like just to tell a kid the truth about what's going on in their life because they can't understand it because they're kids.
mhm,
And I could tell you stories about that, where just telling a kid the truth about what's going on in his life makes a change. It's pretty fast. Uh, so what I've been doing is both meditating, so Zen practice, and that's um, and combining that with focusing. And so what I'm doing with my sitting is to be present with the felt meaning, the implicit, as well as my breath, but not in a discursive way, just to be present to it, not to think about it or reflect or anything like that. Just feel it.
mhm.
And it turns out that's very powerful in an interesting way. That it's um, like insights will come not when I'm sitting, but maybe an hour later or a day later or something. That something just pops into my mind, and it came from the sitting, but it wasn't a focusing process, but it was a felt meaning process. And so I think um, that focusing has something to contribute to meditation. I think a lot of meditation practice is just to empty your mind and just be present. And that can lead to problems because psychological stuff doesn't get worked out. And
Mhm.
we and so you get Chogyam Trungpa running around with all of his,
Mhm.
exploiting his students. Um, and so there's unbalanced development. So I think in the Western world, this is a big story, right? I'm trying to answer a simple question, but um, uh, that we in the West can contribute something to the meditation that came from the East. That with our psychological minds and our psychological culture, we can emphasize these and be aware of these personal aspects, but not in a discursive way, just to feel it, just to be present to it. And then it takes care of itself somehow, just if we can be open to it. So that's part of it. And then part of it is also focusing, and but focusing in a way that's not um, trying to carry something forward, just to listen to it. Um,
So
and the
that's,
critic, so the critic is something that's hard just to listen to,
yeah.
right? You want to fix it or you want to make it go away or something. And so what I've been doing is both in meditation and then outside of meditation, and just kind of almost a mindfulness practice, to be aware of the critic. Just be aware of it, not to do anything, not to fix it, just notice it and notice what it's like. And uh, feeling it in a felt way, not is um, leads to it carrying forward by itself. And so I can say that uh, my critic is much better now than it was, say, 2 years ago. And it's a long-term process. So, like you, it's not going to fix it in a week, and it's not going to fix it either. It's going to open it in some way that's unknown. Um,
So can I
but
just say that back to you to see,
yeah,
as you're talking, I'm uh, trying to make it very concrete for myself. So I want to check that I've understood that if you bring this kind of attitude of Zen meditation together with focusing, what you can do as a practice is bring your attention to the physical felt impact or the physical feeling of the critic,
yeah. Could we say felt meaning more, or the felt sense of?
the felt sense of the critic.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay. That I'm curious about that.
yeah,
But if you can find that, then you just sit with it
yeah.
and nothing else. And if
That's
something
right.
comes, that's fine, but something may come later. But there's something about
Yes,
that very patient, keeping company with, but not doing anything with or doing anything to. That's
right.
helpful.
That's right. And keeping it in view. So it's partly
Yes. Yeah.
um, I'm insisting that in some maybe intrusive way, maybe that I'm keeping you in view.
Yeah.
So you're not going to operate behind the scenes and then blindside me.
Exactly. You're not
I'm
going to
going to be
sneak
present.
up on me. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's good. I really appreciate that. So let's get
yeah,
back to just the felt quality of it, because in my experience, the critic produces a feeling in my body, but itself, it's odd because although I can work with it as a part of me and get a sense of what it's feeling, it may not have a clearly felt sense,
yes, yes,
but
yeah,
you can work with it somehow in that way.
yeah. Let me find it. Yeah, it's very it's difficult. It's like it doesn't feel like a normal felt sense. As
Yeah.
I feel it right now, I can feel it in chest and shoulders, and if I feel further into it, I can feel a kind of a hurt place that's kind of scared, but desperately scared.
Hmm.
And it's those are words that are not yet, it's a feel that, so I say desperately scared. It's more like a handle pointing to something.
Yeah.
Um, but then I'm not going to analyze it. I'm not asking, what are you scared about?
Yeah. Okay.
But what happens is that comes,
Hmm.
and it comes, seems seemingly out of context. And in my case, I've said like things, aspects of my relationship, say with my stepfather, just come in, you know, out of nowhere, just when I'm driving the car or something.
Hmm.
Um, and and there's a temptation to try to work it out conceptually and say, oh well, he did this and this, and you misunderstood it, and it wasn't right, and it just, that's all psycho crap.
Yeah.
Leave that alone. Just be with the feel of it. But
Yeah.
the words come anyway,
Yeah.
and I think the words are useful. It's just that if I try to make it be what the words are right now, that interferes with the process. So it's like the words or the understanding that comes with it is a kind of ephemeral
Hmm.
result of the deeper grounded process.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
yeah, so not to be ignored,
yeah.
but also not to be trusted or relied on.
The
What's real
words,
is the feel of it.
yes, exactly. The words are the epiphenomenon in a way,
Epiphenomenon. That's right. That's right.
not the
And
full.
then, yeah, and then it seems to be changing just by itself. And so
Hmm.
I'm interested if other people try that, if they if it can be helpful, that would be a good thing.
Yeah, that
Um,
resonates for me as you say that.
yeah.
That does.
One danger of this,
Mhm.
and so this is caution to everybody that listens to this podcast, that if you do this, then you should be able to recognize your own process and to know if you're being sucked into the soup. You know, if you're merging with the with the critic process, um, and you have to be able to recognize that and stop that,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
Otherwise, you can get sucked into a bad process, and it'll be not
yeah.
good.
That's why keeping it in view, I guess, is so important.
Yes, keeping it in view. It's not me.
Yeah, exactly.
It's over there, but I'm paying a sympathetic, curious, open attention to it
Yeah.
over there,
Mhm.
not in here.
Yeah, yeah. That's helpful.
Yeah, and that's critical. So if you're beginning focusing and you're not sure that you can do that, then you shouldn't try this yet.
Hmm.
And if you do try it anyway, which if I was listening to this, I would try it anyway. Uh, then when you find yourself, in a really bad place and maybe, uh, 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 overwhelmed by your critic, just recognize that was the mistake. Stop that process, go for a walk, do something else. And then if you do it again, uh, be more aware.
I guess I'm wondering if you have some awareness that the critic might be quite a powerful process for you, that maybe it's useful to try to do it with someone.
I could see that. Yeah. Yeah. And see, I don't know how much um, this depends on my own personal history as a psychotherapist. And, you learn to recognize stuff and distance yourself from inner stuff. Um, I don't know how important that is because I'm an N of one, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Uh, but I think focusing is a good preparation for this practice because focusing does teach us to sit with a felt sense and to not fall into it.
Yes,
Yeah.
interesting. Is there anything else that you would like to talk about? Anything else that's going on that you're passionate about? Or
Um, One thing I'd like to talk about sometime is the culture shock
oh yeah.
and being in a like different a different culture. What's that like for us and the challenges and how language shapes us and learning a different language is like becoming a different person in a way.
Mhm.
And that's probably worth more than 2 or 3 minutes. So that might be another discussion.
Big topic. The one thing that I would say in response is um, just to suggest that culture shock can also happen at home.
Oh yeah, yes, yes. And trauma is
Yeah. Trauma, but not only trauma, but just the feeling of not belonging.
yes,
Uh,
yes.
a lot of people have that experience. I don't know if you can relate to that, but of growing up in a place where you feel like this isn't really my place. I don't really
That's
belong.
right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
And
yeah.
going
That
to,
was my experience growing
yeah,
up. Yeah, yeah,
exactly. And then going to a foreign place where everything is different, sometimes you can think, ah, I finally belong.
That's right. Yes, yes. This is like nobody, but like one doesn't feel at home in a different culture, and because one wouldn't feel at home in a different culture, you feel at home.
Hmm. What? Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
And there's a feeling of the strangeness of the culture, sort of is in a way comforting.
Yeah, finally the strangeness, the unfamiliarity of the culture reflects something fundamental about yourself.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And I think also there's learning the process model was that way for me. There
Hmm.
was a culture shock,
Yeah,
um, and so it's a process. You don't just read the book and then understand it. And,
mm.
you have to struggle and yeah. So that's a big issue, and I, I look forward to maybe talking to you about that
Yeah.
some other time.
The other thing that occurs to me just in reference to the process model and this topic is wondering if there's a way to to have a process of entering a process model rather than feeling like it has to be some kind of leap from one model into this strange new model.
But I think it has to be some kind of a leap because but it doesn't have to be a violent leap necessarily.
Mm.
Um, there's an experience I had
Mm.
with the process model where it's something like wing walking, where you're hanging onto one strut and then you have to let go in order to reach the other strut. Um, there was a feeling of terror.
Uh-huh.
And there's they're kind of strange to think that you could read a book about philosophy. It's pretty abstract and feel terror.
Right.
But I did.
Uh-huh.
And I talked to Gene about it, and he recognized immediately, oh yeah, I know that. Um, and he said, ground in your body.
Yeah,
And then like what it is a conceptual system that you're letting go of. And you don't have a new conceptual system yet well enough to be able to trust it. And the thing would be, don't trust any of the conceptual systems. Trust your body.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't want
So
you don't want to just adopt another system that's top down.
yeah, yeah. And also the shift from one system to another. Uh, it's a gradual shift, uh, but there's a way in which, um, like learning a new language, where there's a point where you suddenly realize that you're dreaming and thinking in the new language, and sometime earlier you weren't,
Mhm.
and so that you can't quite put your finger on the boundary, but there's a way in which it is a shift. And so I think uh, in my case, it was a struggle and it was kind of, um, I wouldn't say violent, but there was a period of deep fear that, that came with it. And maybe that's not necessary, but I think that some kind of shift is going to happen.
So when I start dreaming about BN2, I know that I'm there.
Yes, yes, yes. Uh, yeah. Um, and seriously, if like what I found is that I do take things in deeply and think about them a lot. So I do end up dreaming about them,
Hmm.
and that my dreams are often helpful.
Yes.
And particularly with the eye of eye principle, I don't know if you have, to start another story, but I spent like something like 9 months or maybe a year trying to understand the eye of eye principle. And I was talking to Gene about it every week or so. And it did not penetrate. And it was like banging my head against this wall. And it was for your book, actually.
Okay.
I wanted to explain it in the book.
Yeah.
And the deadline was coming up, and I was getting more and more intense. And I had a dream in which I was explaining it to myself. And so Rob was saying to me, okay, bozo, here's what it is. It's this and this and this, and going through it very carefully and methodically, just in the dream. And I woke up and I called Gene about an hour later because I know he sleeps late. And is this it? And he said basically, yeah, that's what I've been trying to tell you. Uh, so it actually, uh, I think taking it in on that level is,
Yeah,
uh,
that's what I'm getting is that some part of you had taken it in and needed to teach it back to you in language so you could
yeah,
really feel
yeah,
it.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And that's the kind of shift that you go through
Mhm.
if you learn, I guess, probably any new philosophy. But the process model is so carefully crafted for our world and our problems today
Yeah.
that it's more intense for me than it was like with Aristotle or Kant. It-
Yeah.
but I think any shift, any philosophy is going to involve a shift, is my impression.
But maybe you're right. It's a little bit more intense when it's an experiential philosophy.
Yeah, yeah. Um, but then maybe any philosophy has to be experiential in order to be really understood.
I would
Maybe,
agree with
yeah.
you. Yeah. But maybe rarely is.
Maybe what?
Rarely is.
Maybe rarely is exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So all of that is just that it's uh, it's a deep process more than it's like reading a book and then struggling and wrestling with different parts of it and at
Yeah.
different stages and levels and so on.
Yeah.
And it's tremendously fun
Hmm.
for certain, if you're into that kind of thing, it's just like being set loose in the candy store, but with,
Yeah.
you know,
For me, I've read it twice and a long time ago. And when I speak with you or other people that are really into it, I get enthusiastic about going back again,
Mhm.
because it seems like I need a repetition in order to really kind of, for my stomach to kind of feel like, oh yeah, yeah, okay, I got that.
That's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Gene said the way to read philosophy is many times.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, great. Well, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate this conversation, and I feel like I'm leaving with a lot of fresh kind of new threads.
Thank you. This has been fun, and I've appreciated your questions and your just sort of your open attitude.
Hmm,
Yeah.
good. Okay. Well, thank you very much, and take care of yourself.
Okay, you too.
See you later. Bye.